just wanted to begin by giving a short introduction to the volume itself, because that is the context for our getting together today. The first question is why a book of this nature? What is the context? What is the need that it addresses? The book came into existence out of the realization that there is a twofold crisis that we face. On the one hand, the kind of challenges that humanity faces today, with India, of course, being part of the human family, uh, are unprecedented. We have a case of polycrisis, we have climate change, we have geopolitical tensions, we have escalating inequalities. The gulf is just widening unbelievably. There is social fragmentation, there is polarization. I mean, we don't have to narrate the depressing litany of different challenges that we face. We face them all at once. They've all come together and led to a scenario where, and this brings me to the second challenge, where none of the pre-existing models or paradigms of development that humanity relied on seem to address the needs anymore. Development, which was conceived traditionally as with a focus on economic growth, has actually, as we see in the world today, it has actually led to a situation where the environment is gravely degraded. We face an imminent environmental catastrophe. There is the tension between social groups has become unmanageable. There is increasing fragmentation. Inequality has only become more aggravated. So, in response to this state of paralysis, uh, this volume is a modest attempt to ask some of the fundamental questions again, and to say, well, what was development meant to do at the outset? And the premise with which we began is that development is not a technical project. Development is not a mechanistic endeavor. Development is fundamentally a moral endeavor, and it was always meant to bring people together to, like Gandhi said, wipe every tear from the eyes of the depressed, the downtrodden. It was supposed to bring justice to humanity. That was the vision with which development as a international global endeavor had begun. The premise with which we began this endeavor was that we need to go back to the principles that development was meant to uh, re- incarnate in social and economic reality. These were the fundamental principles of uh, human solidarity, of justice, of environmental stewardship, and the posture that we took with the contributors was that these principles cannot be merely rhetorical statements. We cannot draw on them as a form of expediency when we want to sound like we have conviction, we want to sound that we have the common good at heart. They have to be uncompromisable, non negotiable, grounding principles of development, foundational principles. and one has to build with this conviction that these principles are not arbitrary creations of this or that philosopher. These are inescapable features of social existence, and the folly of violating these principles is as calamitous as the folly of breaking the principles that govern material reality. For example, if you don't pay heed to the law of gravity and you step off the edge, you are for sure going to face a grave consequence. We we assumed, or we set out with the assumption that a similar kind of uh, posture has to uh, underpin our attitude to these ethical principles. They cannot be approached opportunistically. They cannot be let go of when it is no more convenient to hold on to them. And we recognize that the process of walking this path is going to be long, it is going to be arduous, tortuous, it's not going to be easy. But one recognizes that the alternative of not doing it is even worse. And the path that humanity has taken so far, with India included in that that train that has been going on this path of development, is we resort to ethics reactively when we find that we really have no other option but to resort to creating systems of solidarity, or creating systems of that embody greater justice, or we have no other option but to address the environmental challenge. The point that we started off with is, let us do it deliberately, let us do it with a sense of foresight, instead of waiting till the next calamity hits us. Can development take these fundamental ethical principles with due seriousness and commit to the process of learning that has to uh, come into play, for us to learn how to embody these principles in structures, in policies. Much has been done in this area. It's not like we are the first ones to raise the flag of ethics and principles, uh, but the voices that speak on behalf of values of ethics, again, their urgency gets recognized only when no other options are left. And as tragically, one also sees that it is forgotten just as swiftly, that the moment circumstances return to a state of some form of normalcy, ethics goes back to being a philosophical consideration for university departments, and not really a serious uh, concern. So with that was the broad consideration that lay behind this volume, which Professor Kundu and myself, we had the privilege of uh, editing and bringing to light. Um, the I won't take more time. This was meant to just be an introduction. I would like to now welcome Professor Kundu.
Ms. Nalakshi Lashkwa, Director, Office of the Baha'i Public Affairs, Professor Arash Fazli, Professor at the Devi Ahilyabai University and having a special chair there. Stephen Schonberger, at the hearing of you, great privilege to have you as a panelist, and Aditi, I know her, colleagues and participants. It's a privilege for me to be associated with this workshop. Particularly, I'm impressed that on a weekend when you postpone some of your regular chores to be done, you have been able to keep that aside and join a book release function. Really, book release functions are not that interesting, and particularly, as somebody mentioned that, well, development dialogues have been a recurring theme of the initiatives of Baha'i Office of Public Affairs. I remember before about 2 decades, in a sultry evening like this, the first book was released. Basically, Baha'i Office has been engaged in discussion on the present development paradigm, what are the challenges and problems being created, and what kind of alternatives can emerge. And this is the 4th one that has come out. And there is small good news and I think a bad news also, which they actually didn't mention. We were expecting the member of parliament. Well, for some engagement he could come and also had to drop out. But the small good news would be that we'll have some time for discussion, and I expect all the participants here to come up with suggestions, questions, or the points. Friends, I mean, over the large part of the 20th century, development has been measured by one indicator. I'm saying large part of the 20th century, and that is per capita GDP. If the per capita income of a country is high and it is growing, we think that it's a decent economy, something which is affluent, and people are comfortable and happy. This assumption has come under serious criticism, serious questioning. And the first major departure made, I think, came up with the initiative of UNDP, United Nations Development Program, in 1990, when, at the leadership of 2 Asian economists, Professor Amartya Sen and Mahbub ul Haq, one coming from India, other from our neighbor, Pakistan, they brought out this Human Development Report, which questioned the validity of per capita income as an index of well-being, talked about education, talked about health, and material well-being, which measured in terms of purchasing power parity and also amenities. And that shifted, in a way, our focus from income and expenditure to life expectancy, to years of schooling, to access of drinking water and sanitation. But within a decade, it was realized that this is not enough, because the country can have a high level of human development, but a large majority can be deprived because inequality exists. So in 2010, United Nations Development Program decided that no, we will have an inequality adjusted human development index. So that if your inequality is high, you're penalized for it. Your value is discounted. Believe me, India doesn't rank very high in human development index. Our position has improved slightly from 133 to 130 in human development index. But if you look at inequality adjusted human development index, our rank is 140, because our inequality in health, education, and income is higher than the average even among the less developed countries. But within another couple of years, UNDP realized this is also not enough, because a country can have a high level of human development by over-exploiting resources, the point that Arash was highlighting. You see, you can have unsustainable resource use, inefficient resource use. So there has to be some adjustment made for a planetary pressure that a country is putting in. So a new index came out, which is Planetary Adjusted Human Development Index, which takes care of sustainability. There are 2 concerns which have come up, as I said. One is inequality, justice, access to all sections of the population, and second is sustainability. These are the two issues I will come back, which has been given a lot of importance in this present volume. But I thought I'll just contextualize the discussion in the global debate which is going on. UN system realized that when we shifted in 2015 from Millennium Development Goal to Sustainable Development Goal, SDG, we realized that there are 17 goals, a number of targets. Are the countries, when they are talking about we are developing, are they really meeting these 17 goals? So an index is being brought out, because I think essentially it has to be measured to see whether we are progressing in the right direction. Instead of competing on GDP, let us compete on education and health and sustainability. There are 17 goals on which indicators were prepared, and under the guidance of Jeffrey Sachs, an index is being prepared. And that index, do you know, in terms of Human Development Index, our rank is 130. In terms of Inequality Adjustment Human Development Index, our rank is 140. But in case of Planetary Adjusted Human Development Index, India is faring better, because our development process, production process is not as capital intensive and as not resource intensive. Our per capita emission in a year would be less than 2 tons, whereas average is about 8 to 9 tons. So obviously our index improves to 115 when you take Planetary Adjusted Human Development Index. And the UN's data on SDG, Sustainable Development Goal Index, places India as 99 this year. Again, that's an improvement, that India's concern for resource efficiency certainly has brought in to some extent. Also, it is partly the incapability of the large sections of the population to go in for high level consumption, all the gadgets. And finally, I want to talk about another index, which is brought out by University of London. Like the Office of the Public Affairs, an independent organization thinking about alternative paradigms of development, University of London is bringing out an index called Sustainable Development Index, not Sustainable Development Goal Index. Sustainable Development Index, wherein the concerns for inequality is there, concern for resource use, inefficiency, and pollution being created, and your consumption basket. Generally, you think that you are consuming more, you have 3 cars, so obviously your income goes up, happiness goes up. He said, if your consumption has a high carbon component, if your ecology-friendly consumption is not there, then you are getting a negative weightage. And they are bringing it out. They have more resources than you have. And they bring out yearly reports. Accommodating the concern that we have discussed in the book, the index shows India having 55th position, much above United States of America, much above Canada. I think these concerns, which are already there in the global debate, the development discussion have moved a long way from per capita income to education, health, to sustainability, to planetary resources adjusted index, to really talk about sustainable development, taking the negativities of your consumption into the framework. Yearly, they are bringing it out. And that, I think, is extremely important, and we do find that these concerns need to be brought in. I'm not saying the methodology that has been used by University of London is absolute fine. It has not yet accepted globally by the UN system, but certainly it is making us think in the right direction. And that's why I thought this volume which has come out, again, we're exploring the similar concerns of development alternatives, but certainly it is thinking in the right direction. I just want to say I was very impressed that the issues that have been debated here are resonating, the global issues which are coming out from these 5 different ways of measuring development and sustainability. I don't want to comment on individual papers. We don't have time for that. And if I be selective, I will be charged of the bias to some of the authors. But I really enjoyed reading it and learned a lot. I would put the volume I don't want to reduce the sale of Mr. Manak by giving some idea about the structure of the book. Our publisher, Mr. Yadav, is here. First set of, do you have 2 3 minutes more?
Yes, yes.
You see, first set of papers concern about the problems and challenges which have been created by the paradigm of current development, right? The poverty, inequality, and basically arguing. There are 5 papers which are arguing that this consequences are of serious nature and they need to be addressed by alternative thinking. The second set of papers talking about institutions, labor laws, social security, how you can really take the issues of inequality and sustainability together. And it also talks about community participation, the cooperative movement, and how that can be brought in to make development more oriented to social justice. The third set of papers talk about resilience and sustainable development, talks about some of the local practices, traditional forms of production, basically saying let's not dismantle all the traditional things that are old and inefficient. There are values and we need to look at them. And finally, there is a set which talks about epistemological issues, some of the conceptual issues. How do we look at development? What kind of definition do we have for equity? What kind of definition do we have for sustainability? There are conceptual questions which have been raised. They are providing the basis for the discussion. Friends, the essential message that comes from the book is that promoting sustainable development fundamentally has to be, as Dr. Fazli mentioned, a social and moral project and not a technical tool. It must force us to rethink our assumptions about human well being, justice, and our relationship with nature. What is particularly striking is that the issues raised in the global debates on development and sustainability, as I tried to present through the 5 different indicators, these issues figured prominently in different chapters of the book. In the earlier decades, the development discussion asked this question: how can we be rich? How can we have more material well being? But currently, the humanity asking a much more deeper and much more serious question: that how can we pursue progress in a ways that is equitable, socially inclusive, environmentally sustainable, and grounded in justice and cooperation. At the present time of deepening geopolitical tensions and violent conflicts, with the drones and missiles flying all around us, we realize how fragile our system of cooperation and governance has become today. In such a context, the question raised in this volume become all the more significant. It is in this spirit that dialogues on development brought out by the Office of Baha'i Public Affairs seeks to contribute to an ongoing global conversation that I tried to summarize. In the divided world of ours, the search for just and sustainable development, for that, dialogues of this nature must continue. Thank you.
Chair for Studies in Development, coming out with this volume discussing issues which are so very relevant today, not only globally, but I think especially in India, because the country is now wanting to step up, both in terms of the global power relations, but also internally trying to develop in a way which will give justice to all its people. So I think the questions that need to be asked and the discussions will be very relevant to our country too. Um, I must also thank the organizers for inviting me here, and it's always a pleasure to be at any Baha'i event. So thank you so much. Um, when I first got this invite, actually, and I looked at the introduction to the book which had been shared with me, uh, the first thing that came into my mind were really questions. And I wanted to share some of them to you. Was that, is the book utopian? How much can really be changed in the future? Because there's so many unknowns now. So how much can really be changed? The book's focus on people-centered development has been around for decades now. I mean, when I started working in the 80s, we've been discussing this. Of course, the contours have changed, but we've discussed a lot on what it really means, people-centered development. And then especially what does it mean when we are looking at socially stratified heterogeneous societies? And, Professor Fazli did mention that. And not just in terms of, you know, heterogeneity in terms of ethnic background or religion or whatever, but also the different geographies, the physical different infrastructure, the heterogeneity in knowledge, local knowledge, traditional knowledge, scientific knowledge. So there is so much of heterogeneity. What does it really mean when we are saying people-centered documents? You can see there was a lot of questions in my mind before I started reading the book, the introduction. And then in it all, because it's of special interest to me, where does gender really fit in? Because there's just not gender division of labor, but there's also gender division of knowledge, gender division of physical assets. So where does it all really sit in? Because it's really cross cutting. And last but certainly not the least, when we are talking about ethical development, which is really, very rightly said by the editors, gives the book a very unique and a much required dimension. What does it really mean? Because ethical and value, there are universal values, yes, but today, with all the polarization, with all the different ideologies and opinions and, thought processes, what does ethical really mean when we're talking about people centered development? So, what I'm going to say is not going to give you answers to all my questions, but I hope that in the discussions that we have, we'll be able to unpack some of them. But let me begin by saying that, yes, I do agree with the editors that development plans, as they say, built in log frames, which is what we are really used to, result oriented log frames, right? They operate in silos, whereas people's lives really develop in more organic and holistic ways. And many of us who have been to the field realize that that is extremely important, and that's missed by the planners and the policymakers. So I think that's something which is really, really important. And I think it forms the basis really for ethical, moving towards what is really a value based or an ethical development. I also agree with the editors when they say that it's very important to reset the development paradigm through foresight, because I think it's important to have this foresight both in thought and in action. Having said that, let me also say that while there's a lot in the book that contributes to this foresight, it's also very important to understand that it's a difficult proposition because you have to shape a future that is both real and ideal and sustainable across generations. That's a tall order, right? So I think it's very interesting to read, these papers, and like I said, I've read the introduction, but I've been very intrigued by some of the conceptual discussions that have happened, and later in the discussion, I could mention one or two which have really gripped me, but I will not do that right now. But I will mention some of the kind of, if I may use the word, prescriptions, or the ways to move forward, which the authors have offered. So for instance, it means, for instance, socio-economic protection to informal workers. Again, informal workers is something that my work has involved. So protection. Some of these are already now in place at the policy level, but they still do not address the systematic socio-cultural and gender-based marginalization, right? Similarly, recent policies which are according to informal workers do give them legal recognition. So especially even waste workers, etc. Now everybody, they have legal recognition. Cooperatives are being promoted. So there's a lot of development action which has happened, on the ground action, which has happened on care, on some action on redistribution of care responsibilities, but I think we are far, far, far from there. But definitely on consultative decision making and community management of commons, right? Water bodies, etc. But all this, this new policies, these actions on the ground, they've not resulted in really the way people-centered, value-based development that should happen, which would hold over time and space and generations. So I think that is something that we really need to discuss. Let me just quickly give an example from my own work, which has been on climate change adaptation in agriculture. And to say that adaptation has really focused on how to adapt to climate vagaries, as we call them, the climate uncertainties, but not on what adaptation does to human systems. And that is key to people centered development because adaptive interventions address the vulnerabilities of the geophysical system, right? So we say, okay, we need to adapt, we need to do this so that the geophysical system we can contain at different locations because adaptation is really very local, but they may not work in the longer run because of the social dimensions of the interventions. And let me quickly give you an example of sea walls. So, in Maldives, in Malé, for instance, Malé in Maldives doesn't have a beach because it has only sea walls. Kerala, for instance, now there's so many seawalls and more are being built. And what has happened is that fisherwomen whose income of sorting and drying the fish and doing local marketing was really very important for fisher households. They have lost their jobs because now they have these markets in the ports, etc., where harvesting of fish is done, sorting is done. There's a lot of middlemen who have come in, a lot of migrant labor who have come in, and women cannot travel all the way and do all this. So, and this is both in Maldives and in Kerala. So, which means that as sea walls, there's grey infrastructure, we've adapted, but obviously we've not really adapted because a lot of the next generation is going out. They don't want to do fishing, right? So, I think these are things that we really need to look at. Well, while perfect solutions are difficult, and I'm just, on my last bit, so perfect solutions are difficult. What I've done is let's look at, say, three future scenarios. Can we build scenarios, right, which would really be amalgamating a whole lot of things. So let me share with you three scenarios in the future which could be the way forward. The first, of course, is business as usual, where some people gain but many lose out, which is what was very eloquently explained by Professor here. But perhaps I see less possibility of this scenario to continue. And I see a greater possibility of the second scenario, which I can call either a more egalitarian society or what has been called participative development, where it is easier for more people to leverage capital, technology, and knowledge, including AI, for more equitable benefits. There is, for example, of course, there's example of the ubiquitous use of cell phones and UPI, and then now with AI, people who cannot write emails are now being able to write emails to authorities to argue their own case directly. Then, of course, there are gains in retail marketing by ordinary, rural women in health, education, knowledge sector. So even in the agrarian sector, we have more adaptive mechanisms where in organic agriculture, for instance, where there's more workload on women, capital intensive devices can actually reduce labor and drudgery of these women. So, the thing is that we can look at a more participative development equitable structure. The third scenario, which is closer to the utopian one, is what I may call back to the basics, where local is preferred over global, where there's slow food, much more than only in developing countries like India. Go local, pedestrian walkways, spirituality gained consumption, which is extremely important, etc. And I think the chapter on the young leaders does talk about it, and I'll come to that. And not this non-ethical, exploitative, consumptive lifestyle which you also referred to. So this essentially requires behavioral change, and perhaps that is where we need to put more thought. So it's not just policy change or political or economic change; it's behavioral change. But there's a fair chance that some countries, some sections of societies may move towards this, though they may also just remain enclaves. So those, I think, are kind of the three scenarios that I would like to share. And the last point is that I think the youth leadership chapter is extremely important because, especially for India, since we have the demographic dividend at least for some time before we all grow old. And again, what is really required is a change within. And the authors talk about the fifth space where they can all come together and explore that change within, and then also help others to do that. But I think what is important is the other four spaces, the authoritarian spaces, because they need to change, whether it is home or family or their educational institutions, their workplace. So I think that is something, and that's different in rural, urban, peri-urban areas. So I think that is something that really requires much more thought. Let me conclude by saying that there is some hope that we may move closer to the back to the basics scenario or the people-centered development scenarios, but we'll probably continue to live in a world dominated by the second scenario, which is a more egalitarian way of using the modern capital, technology, and all, rather than continue on this business as usual scenario. So I think there's more hope than pessimism in the way forward. Thank you.
Professor Kundu asked me to be a bit provocative, shall we say. And that's really difficult when I agree with everything Dr. Fazli said, Professor Kundu said, and Dr. Kapoor's very practical points. So I'm going to do something very different, I'm afraid, but I think it's in the spirit of trying to, and I think it's consistent with what others are doing, which is to try and really open up in our thinking a bit about what this development discussion is. I could get into the specifics, but maybe I could do that more in the discussion if that's helpful. So first, obviously, I want to compliment the editors and contributors to this volume, which is both challenging our thinking, but while also offering us some alternative ideas and experiences of what we might think of as mainstream development. At the same time, I'd like us to take a step back and suggest that we really need to get rid of the idea of development, as it just traps us into a counterproductive way of thinking that, to paraphrase Krishnamurti, is like painting the prison walls. Okay? So let me explain this. Let me try to apply the durational thinking approach, which is proposed in the second chapter of the book, which places our actions in time. And I think every chapter is a good chapter, but read that chapter, please. I mean, it's one of the most interesting and thoughtful ways of it helps us to challenge our own paradigms. So inherent in any discussion of development is how we understand the pursuit of human progress, and that was mentioned a number of times. And underlying the practice of development is the belief in progress as being linear, forward-moving, rational, technological, and, as was mentioned, material. However, this perspective is specific both in culture and time. Most Asian and African cultures and many Western indigenous cultures have historically described human progress in terms of passing through cycles of advancement with repeated decline and renewal in pursuit of moral, spiritual, and cosmic harmony. Classical Chinese and Greek philosophers saw human progress as pursuing a return to an idealized, uncorrupted path. So very different perspectives than what we normally think of today. Mainstream Western thought evolved the idea of progress as a consistent, if sometimes interrupted, journey from meeting our basic physical needs to eventually being able to express our spiritual and intellectual potential. So hence, personal and community improvements would provide the space for pursuing religion, art, and philosophy. So again, even though more conventional, a very different view of what the endpoint is about. By the time of the Enlightenment, it was very much believed that human progress, like the physical world, had a somewhat deterministic trajectory, whether it was Mills's individual liberty or Marx's socialism, that there was a certain inevitability to the direction in which society was going. And so it was therefore subject to a scientific approach which could be applied to accelerate progress. So in essence, progress was predetermined in terms of its outcomes, whether it was the socialist view of Marx or the individualistic view of Mills. And so since it was predetermined just like physics in a sense, we could affect that and manipulate it through the application of science. So by the 19th and early 20th centuries, progress was increasingly viewed in materialistic terms, and the nation state was identified as the principal instrument and responsible party for encouraging progress. And that was driven largely by market forces and technological innovation, as we've seen. So while civilizations have been trying to improve each other throughout history through the export of religious, administrative, technological, and other mechanisms through trade and conquest, so the idea of trying to influence each other is as long as human history. That's not a new idea. The so-called modern development practice emerged largely from the European colonial experience. The semi-private trading companies focused on extracting economic value with only gradual consideration of the populations of the colonized countries as anything other than sources of labor or trading partners. However, the arrival of the trading companies was also accompanied by missionaries who were intent on spreading Christianity to the local populations. And they quickly realized that for people to be able to take in the gospel message of Christianity, they first needed reasonably healthy bodies, and secondly, needed to be able to read the Bible. It was as basic as that. So, what did they do? The missionaries started providing medical care and teaching literacy. And these can be seen as the first community-based development activities, with missionaries of all the different faiths opening schools, running clinics, and seeking to improve and civilize the bodies and souls of the people in the colonies. By the end of the 19th century, the Dutch government developed an ethical policy which promoted social welfare projects to support what was coming to be known as the development of the native peoples. Science and technology, bureaucracy, and large state-led projects, often in the agricultural sector, were at the core of this new approach to colonial development. The missionaries had a different approach, as we've seen, and that sought holistic change of the whole person, body and soul, towards living a comfortable and meaningful, abundant life, in contrast to imperial development policies that sought to displace small-scale agriculture and replace it with large-scale mechanized agriculture. For example, the British missionaries developed a theology of the soil to guide their approach to agricultural development, in which religious conversion, combined with small-scale technical inputs, would lead to improvements in agricultural productivity and harmonious rural communities, rather than make profit and riches for the colonial overseers. So even within the colonial world, there were these very different views about what development meant and how to take it forward and what the ultimate objective was. So we see the outlines of two very different approaches begin to crystallize. One state-led, essentially top-down and extractive from rural areas, and another focused on building capacities at the community level and almost entirely on improving the lives and livelihoods of local people. And these remain pretty representative of the broad paradigms we see today in development discourse, and I think Dr. Kapoor sort of alluded to these as very different approaches. And their tension, I think, is really well reflected in the book. So it's kind of one of the underlying themes that's constantly there. So development as a formal field or a practice really just emerged after World War II. As colonialism was collapsing, there was further consolidation of the nation state in both developed and developing countries as a dominant basis for political and economic engagement amongst peoples. And a host of international organizations, including the one I was a part of, national aid agencies and NGOs, emerged to execute the development agenda, which, whether focused on the top-down or the community-led approaches, reflected an inherent basis that essentially, if inadvertently, reinforces Western cultural hegemony while dismissing or diminishing alternative cultural frameworks. And I think that's very important. It's well-meaning, but it comes out of a history, and I think that's what the second chapter's point was, is that we have to understand where things come out of. So often one thinks, well, the alternative is a community-based approach. Well, it's a good approach, but remember, that also came out of a colonial context. And it has a very strong cultural bias inherent in it. Each of us will decide whether that cultural bias is good or bad, but it has a strong cultural bias because it comes out of a history. So my point in sharing this brief, and it is very much a personal perspective of history, is to suggest that, and I'm going to call it developmentalism, whether it's top-down or grassroots focused, is really just another anomaly of a fairly recent colonial past. And what we need instead is return to a focus on progress. So I propose, let's get rid of the word development. It's ridiculous. The fact that we even speak about developed versus less developed countries is extraordinary. right? And that's based primarily, yes, historically, on the level of GDP. Normally, you need $20,000 to $30,000 per capita these days to be considered developed. But even in the context of the Human Development Index, you just add in, it's still per capita income. You add in a little education, you add in, a little bit of health, life expectancy, but it's still very much rooted in that same paradigm. And it still brings up this idea of developed versus developing. I mean, please. I find it incredibly offensive as an idea. First, because it creates the illusion that the so-called developed countries have somehow attained, whether you call it eudaimonia, telos, fulfillment, utopia, ramraja, dharma, whatever term you use to describe a successful country. And the result, our society, and it therefore creates a false sense of complacency on the part of the so-called developed countries. They stop trying. They think they're fine. They're the developed. On the other hand, it also devalues many of the societal values and characteristics in lower income communities and countries that we so desperately need in the world for true progress. So we both have a laziness on one side and we have a devaluation on the other side of things that actually we need desperately. So my modest proposal is that we exercise the term development from our conversations and focus on progress. So we place the emphasis on the nature of the means to promote common values that unify and improve lives in the holistic manner highlighted by many of the authors and found well explained, I believe, in the Baha'i faith and other spiritual writings. So again, progress does not have an end. You can't be progressive and progressive. Everyone is progressive. So to conclude, my suggestions are for us to, one, read this excellent book to shake up your thinking, because it certainly shook up mine. Two, expunge the term development and return to an emphasis on human progress. And three, open our minds to the contributions to progress that can come from every corner of civilization, be it traditional communities, spiritual writings, artists, cooperatives, youth, and yes, even lawyers and macroeconomists. Thank you.
आइए
more than others, and one of them really, which I would like to read, is the chapter which talks about language. So the fact that which is the one that
Devi, the last one.
Diminishing languages, and I mean it's called diminishing languages and destructive development, but let's not go about that. But basically, how you frame something is how you understand it. So and if you lose language, then that creates problems. And for me, one of the problems has been speaking in English, because a lot of what I have grown up with culturally, there is no equivalent in Hindi, including something like gender. मतलब मेरे पास शब्द ही नहीं है. अगर if I talk to ordinary people, I don't know how to communicate what I'm doing, because मेरे पास भाषा ही नहीं है, language नहीं है. I don't have the language. And so, for instance, I think what this whole thing about terming development, say, as progress, it's the same thing to me, because pragati का कुछ मतलब नहीं है. Pragati, vikas, it's all Prayavachi hai. They're all the same. Synonyms. So if I look at it from my perspective, then I would go in really, looking at what is really the people who are going to bring about the change, right? I'm not going to be there 30 years, 40 years from now, I don't know when, whatever, but I think the youngsters. So the word that I would really look at in English, if I was to look at, is evolve. So to me, that would really bring about the change, right? So for value-based development, I would really say that evolve. And evolve, you have to begin from self. You have to first evolve, then you can be a catalyst for other people to evolve. So I think it's important to say how individuals, and change always begins with individual. वो हम लोग हिंदी में कहते हैं ना, बूंद बूंद से सागर बनता है. So it's always individuals who bring about that change. So the thing is that how do I evolve? Then how does my family evolve? You say, well, you teach a woman and you teach a family. So how does my family evolve? How does my extended family evolve? My community, my society. So the idea is that then once you start evolving, then and then the idea is that you achieve more contentment. So what the end, uh, kind of the end of development is really contentment. But if you combine it with evolving and then achieving contentment, then you get to where you're looking at really spirituality and consumption. So I would look, if I look, then my mind looks at it from my cultural perspective, because this is what I have grown up with. And if I look at, say, what I have learned, then I would say dharma to me is most important because it's basically right duty. If you do right duty, then you don't have to ask for rights. So I think for each one of us, it's important to go back to what we've grown up with and to contextualize it. And which is why this chapter on language I thought was so important, because language and culture are intertwined. And we learn it first in the laps of our mothers and grandmothers. And that comes to us best. And that is what we are taught actually by our mothers and grandmothers. But as we grow up, we somehow lose it, right? But I think maybe that is something that we really need to come back to. So I would just like to rest there.
I enjoyed so much what you just said, so but I'll come to the very practical again, because that was originally what I think I've been asked. In terms of agency, how do we help encourage that sense of agency, which I agree is absolutely at the core of moving forward, of progress, of evolution, of all of this. My own thought on it is that what's most important in the first instance is helping to the sense of safety. Mm-hmm. I think agency without safety is very challenging. And I just came back yesterday from Cambodia, where I had the strange opportunity of seeing the results of a program I helped start 20 years ago, which was to give land, public land, and title to poor landless laborers, which we didn't think it would necessarily work, but we thought it was worth a try. And it seems to kind of work. And it worked to the extent because people felt safety. And in that case, the types of safety that they mentioned was, of course, having, they had their land titles, so they felt the security of tenure. They felt they could protect their land against encroachment, people trying to take it away, which is a major problem in Cambodia. And secondly, there was the assurance that since they were self-employed now, they had their little farm plot, greenhouse, etc. They regularly said it was, and we heard it in different villages from so many different people and different indigenous communities, women, men, everyone, was it the ability to wake up in the morning and feel the security of what they were going to do to earn their livelihood, which in their case was now to go to their garden and work on their vegetables, was enormously important to them. It was a source of security that was incredibly profound. And I think that and then you saw the difference in agency, because the same people who I saw 20 years ago sort of bowing their heads and sitting on the ground in front of the government officials were in a humorous way, but confronting the officials and challenging and engaging. And I think it's because they felt a certain security. So I guess I would just add the idea of security to what is required, or how one can help to build or encourage agency.
I'll be really very brief because I want, since the accident, we have some time. I would like to participants who have left some of the work on a weekend to attend this. I'm sure they have something to say on these issues. First, replacing the word development by progress. We had a huge debate globally and also within India. We're talking about growth. And we thought growth is more on the materialistic side, income, consumption, expenditure. Development is a much better word to capture the other dimensions. Anyway, the origin of the word development is from envelope. It was really encompassing a larger dimensions. That's how the word development came to exist. So I thought that if we have a perspective of utopia or some ideal set, you try to define it. Unless you define it, then you're talking really among friends and in discussion. Where if it is to go into policy making, you have to define that these are the parameters. From GDP, we move to three dimensions: education, health, material well-being. We are saying we are doing the same thing, but we try to adjust it. And you say, okay, there are inadequacies. Unless you make a mistake, you don't correct it. We again corrected it for nature, natural pressure. Then we said, no, that's not enough. There are 17 development goals. Can we incorporate that? So we have an overall framework. And now we have a wonderful exercise being done by University of London, which is sensitizing the whole world, saying that even 17 goals are not enough. The way you are consuming the the resource use inefficiency is so high in the developed countries. Their ecological footprints are going to Latin America, to Africa, and you incorporate that, and that is the sensitivity which is coming in through measurement. I'm saying that all the measurement are not necessarily point decimal point shifting here and there, doesn't matter, but you sensitize, saying that look, these are the other dimensions. If you incorporate, you find the ranking to be completely changed. Imagine India ranking 55th, United States of America ranking 129th, Australia ranking somewhere at 134. Basically showing that there are certain dimensions which are being ignored in the development paradigm. The word, whether it is progress or development, doesn't matter, but it has to be some kind of envelope concept. I just briefly talk about two things that Aditi brought in. I don't think she suggested directly, but I do feel, Arash, it's a comment on you. We didn't have a chapter, since you're talking about justice, inequality, we didn't have a chapter on gender.
There is one.
There is one. But I noted one thing, that gender comes in the informal sector in a very significant manner. When you talk about technology to adjust, to have a resilient system, we talk about adaptation strategies. The burden of the environmental pressure comes on the woman. Even the technology that comes in, is it really woman friendly? These are the issues which have indirectly come up in other sections. So I always feel that instead of having a gender specialist, if an agricultural specialist look at the problems of the gender, who understand agriculture, they can perhaps get better insight. So I thought that we should try to let the gender issue come up in other areas, but gender is the most sensitive and most devastating thing as far as India is concerned. I have a report. I think I don't know whether there's any other report which talks about India discriminates. That is the title of the volume. It's not India's inequality. There are many reports. India discriminates, and discrimination is different from inequality. Discrimination means other things remaining equal. If you are getting a different outcome because of your personal identity, your gender, your caste, your religion, that is discrimination. But if there's inequality because of the capabilities being different, then of course it is understandable. Aditi, I'll tell you, caste discrimination in our study, which is an empirical study based on the National Sample Survey data, shows caste inequality is something like 40% in the rural areas. And the urban areas, caste discrimination is not that much because of government intervention. Religious discrimination, particularly about the Muslim minorities, is very high in the urban areas, something like 55%. It is more or less stable over the period of 5-7 years. Gender discrimination is 95%.
My goodness.
And that is so shocking. You will say, how is it possible? I'm not saying that every woman goes to the labor market and she gets rejected. This is only labor market discrimination. I'll give you statistics, you'll be surprised. How many men you know who have a graduation degree in the age group of 25 to 55 who is not working? Do you know many men who are in the age group of 25 to, let's say, 60 who are not working? Not many. But do you know among women who have a graduation degree who is not working in the age of 25 to 30 is how much? 58%.
Even in Kerala, it's very
high. Only 42% of the women who have a graduation degree do not. It's not necessarily because they are being rejected. Many of them don't go to the labor market. Aditi, you talk about mindset. मेरे family में नहीं था. My caste doesn't permit. Oh, I have my mother-in-law and father-in-law. Who will look after them? And it's not necessary. My husband is comfortable. Imagine PhD degree holders, 100 women PhD degree holders, not more than 35% of them are working. Rest of them don't need to. They said it's not discrimination, but in our model, Okaka blinder model, we say anybody who is not in the labor market but have the capability. So that is something which is extremely important. Final one point I wanted to mention, and really I really want to listen to your points. You talk about agency. You talk about people-centric development. People-centric development, when you talk about it, it really doesn't mean withdrawal of the state. I know one very strong argument. Get off the back of the poor. The government should get out of this and let the people decide. People don't have the capability at the moment unless you provide to understand what kind of deficiencies they are facing. It is Ambedkar who said that I don't believe democracy at the grassroots level because the power vested interest and power structure is so much that it's not possible for them to exercise the judgment. So, to say that state should withdraw and then we'll have people's participation, people agency, that would be very, very idealistic. Let's think about how this can take place. As I was,
Who has said that the state should withdraw? I haven't heard that.
oh, I have heard it so many times.
Really?
We will sit together and say that get off the back of the poor, and the people will be poor will be able to take care of it. There is a study by Kine who shows that in the African countries, wherever international money came up, given the power structure, even including the projects, given the power structure, it's the elite class who benefit, and the poor people get small benefit, and they think very, very happy. They don't question the existing power structure. So that is something which worries me. Maybe you have other experiences which you'd like to share, but certainly this transition has to be done in a smooth manner. And as I was telling you at tea break, that is a Gramsci who said there's a period of transition. There's a great risk of demons taking over. So we have to be very careful about this kind of a transition.